Hello everyone. Welcome to our next session on virtual clusters with the namespaces. So in the previous session, we have understood once the Kubernetes is installed, the cluster will be created. So in that cluster, we will be deploying our applications via the commands. So now coming to the namespaces, why we required namespaces under the cluster. Namespace it partition a Kubernetes cluster and are designed as an easy way to apply quotas and policies to group of objects. So once we have the cluster, we will be creating the namespaces. So why we need namespaces? We have to create it. It is just namespace are required to group the objects. Group the object in the sense, consider one of the best example when you are working in a project, you will be having the dev environment, QA environment, and test environment. You may be required to apply some rules, different rules for QA environment and some different rules for dev environment. So in that case, what we are going to do is in the Kubernetes cluster, we are going to create three namespaces: dev namespace, QA namespace, and the test namespace. So what is the main advantage of creating the namespaces and applying all the objects across the environment is it will partition the objects. So object in the sense, object may be pod, right? The object may be pod, object may be deployment, object may be services, object can be anything. So whenever you are deploying your application as a Kubernetes object to the cluster, we will define the namespace. So in which namespace you want to deploy an object. Say for example, you are creating a pod, in which namespace, whether you want to deploy that deploy your pod in under the dev namespace or under the QA namespace or under the test namespace. So we will be defining the namespace. So when you are not deploying the any namespace while the deployment, while the execution of the command, so your Kubernetes will by default, it will consider it as a default namespace. What is the meaning of default namespace? When you are installing the Kubernetes and when cluster is got created, it will assign to the default namespace. If you are not mentioning any namespace, it will take it as a default namespace. Let us see few commands and we'll try to understand more about the namespaces of the Kubernetes. So the first command kubectl API -resources. Kubectl API -resources. So what is this command it will do? Kubectl API resources, it will show all the resources, whether it is a namespaced or not. What is the meaning of namespaced? When you are deploying any Kubernetes object, example pod, and if you are mentioning the namespace, it will be under that particular namespace. It can be default namespace or any custom namespace. So that it all the object it will show you whether it is a namespaced or not. So if the any object it is deployed under the namespace, we call it as a namespaced object. So then kubectl get namespaces. How do you get the all the namespaces? Kubectl get namespaces is the command to get all the namespaces. So if you see here, one is a default namespace and these kube node lease, kube public, kube system, these are by default created when you are installing the Kubernetes cluster. So this is the QA namespace which we have created. This is a custom namespace and this is the default namespace. So the next, how do you describe? Will describe the namespace. Even you know no need to mention the complete namespace. If you mention while executing the command, if you just mention ns, the Kubernetes it will understand it's a namespace. So kubectl describe ns default. So it's a default Kubernetes namespace. I am just inspecting it. So the label and this is a default and the status is active. So then how do you get the particular environment namespaces objects? Say if you want to get all the pods, kubectl get pods. If you do like this, it will give the namespaces of the default namespace. It will give the parts of default namespace. So let us see what all the parts are there in the namespace. Which namespace I am telling? QA namespace. QA namespace. So QA namespace. So we will see what all the parts are there in the QA namespace. kubectl get parts hyphen n, and this is the QA namespace. So when you are mentioning the namespace, you can mention hyphen n, or you can even mention uh, hyphen n or hyphen namespace also we can mention. So hyphen n QA namespace. So you see no resources found in the QA namespace. That means we have not created any namespaces, any pod objects under the QA namespace. We have created pods in the default namespace. That's why we are getting the uh, pods in the default namespace. So you see the get pods. If I am not mentioning any namespace, it is taking as a default namespace. So if you go to the next command, kubectl create a namespace. Like how do you create a namespace? So the command is kubectl create namespace is nothing but ns, and I am going to create test namespace. So this shows the test namespace got created. So if you see the get namespaces, it will display all the namespaces. The test namespace just we have created. The next command, even you can create. Now we have created the namespace manually. Even you can create this namespace via the commands, via the YAML file. So here I have created already the namespace.yaml file. So this YAML file, if you want to create a namespace, say our Visual Studio Code is already integrated with Copilot. So when I simply just click Control I, so deployment Kubernetes YAML, Kubernetes, not deployment. I will just say the namespace template. Kubernetes namespace template. Kubernetes namespace template. Let us see what the output I will get. So it's just generating. So yeah. So now it's automatically the Copilot got it. It is just given our namespace template. The API version, the schema we are using the V1, and what kind of object we are creating. It's a namespace. It's a namespace we are creating, and metadata information. It will just display the to identify the namespace via the name. You have to mention your namespace. So test namespace we have already created. For example, I want to create prod namespace, and the label you can give the any name. It will be sensitive. Like if you are giving any caps letter, it will not allow, it will throw an error. So the we have created a template. Let us create prod namespace via the by executing this command. So kubectl apply hyphen f. We have the namespace.yaml file. If you just click enter, so the namespace prod namespace is got created. Now if you see the get all the namespaces, we have already created prod namespace. So via the YAML file also we can create the namespaces. And then how do you delete the namespace? It is just a straightforward command to delete the namespaces. For example, I want to delete this test namespace. You can just say kubectl delete ns and the test namespace. It will just delete the test namespace got deleted. Namespace test space is test namespace got deleted. The next command is kubectl config set. So this what is this command? Kubectl config set context. So say for example, whenever you are communicating with the Kubernetes, we will be having the kubectl file, right? Kube config file. Kubectl config view. So this already in the previous session we have seen where this file will be there and all. So this is the kubectl config file, and here if you see what is the cluster name, this is the cluster name Docker desktop cluster, because I have just installed the Docker desktop in my local system. So this is the cluster name. And what is the correct current context is Docker desktop only. And if you see the namespace, what is the namespace? It's the default namespace. So by if we are not assigned our cluster to any of the namespace. So now whenever we are creating any pods or deployments or services, any kind of Kubernetes object, all the things it will go to the in this namespace only, right? So for example, if you want to deploy your pods, deployments and services under prod namespace, which we are just now we created, if you want to move that everything, so you have to change this cluster config. What is this cluster config namespace? It's a default. So now I can change it. I can change it to some other namespace which we want. So kubectl config, the command is kubectl config, then set context space, and I can say current context. I'm just setting the current context. What is the current context namespace which we have seen? It's a default one. So now I'm setting the current context namespace as prod namespace. When I click enter, context Docker desktop is modified. See here namespace we have seen the default. Now if you execute this command config view, we should be able to see the prod namespace. See, I just had a kubectl config view. Now the cluster desktop and namespace is prod namespace. Default namespace we have removed. Now whatever the kubectl commands we are executing, for example, we have already the pod.yaml kubectl apply. We have a file pod.yaml file. So if I apply this, so this should be created under prod namespace. See this prod namespace, it should have been already created. Now if you see kubectl get pods, now under the namespace pod we created prod namespace. So hyphen namespace, so prod namespace. See now, just now we created the pod under the namespace. How we are, see, whenever you are creating a pod object, we have not mentioned any namespace here, right? It's pod is by default it is created. We have not mentioned any namespace while creation of the pod. By default it has taken the prod namespace, because the Docker desktop context we change it from default to prod namespace. So that is why we are able to see the pods under the pod under the production namespace. That's how the namespace it occurs. The only thing is we are segregating the objects based upon the names. So that means instead of creating all the pods in single cluster, we are creating a virtual clusters by using the namespace concept in the Kubernetes. We are just segregating the cluster by with the namespace. If you have any questions, feel free to post it in the comment section. Thank you.